Oh hi, I'm the Heretic. The following is not so much a video essay as it is an observation I've made as I've studied modern history, more like a rant, but I still want to be as accurate as possible, and someone more knowledgeable in history should correct me in the comments below. Anyways, when I say counterculture, I mean to differentiate between the anti-Vietnam War protests of the late 60s into the early 70s. Counterculture describes a set of value and behavioral norms separated from and often opposed to mainstream culture, usually populated by young people. While the anti-Vietnam War protests, as well as the hippie culture of free love and drugs that became associated with it, is a counterculture, this differentiation enables inclusion of many movements I seek to use as examples that fit the definition I am using. Now, think historically. Every 1 or 2 decades, there is a major counterculture that emerges, demonized by moral guardians and priests of statism alike as being degenerate, subversive, or any number of nasty-sounding adjectives. They're often portrayed as naive, disrespectful to modern constructs of government. Charges of victimizing other people, including themselves, are often levied against them. For example, during the age of jazz, moral busybodies often describe the dancing movements of jazz fans as seductive and hypnotic. Rap and hip-hop in the 90s was charged as being disrespectful to women and disrespectful to cockroaches. Not respecting the blue uniformed armed thugs with badges with legally recognized carte blanche to victimize people however they see fit in the name of legislation enforcement. Imagine being disrespectful to those guys. But anyways, this moral admonition is sometimes accompanied by political violence, as the counterculture is associated with some other cultural taboo that the government has illegalized that justifies said violence. Those hippies were selling drugs, so that makes beating those kids half to death who just didn't want to be enslaved into fulfilling the foreign policy objectives of the priesthood of statism okay. In the 30s, some universities had curfews at 10 p.m., with both feet required to be on the floor at all times, policies designed clearly to restrict late-night dancing with gender-segregated infrastructure to limit intersex mingling. The Israeli government's appointed moral guardians banned the Beatles from performing in their country, according to Resolution 691. Resolved not to allow the request for fear that the performances by the Beatles are liable to have a negative influence on the country's youth. Speaking of the Beatles, the BBC banned these Beatles songs for British Airways for the following reasons. Being for the benefit of Mr. Kite, a song about a circus and inspired by a circus poster. The BBC interpreted Henry the Horse to be an allegory for heroin, much to the confusion of John Lennon. Come Together, a mostly nonsensical song that was banned due to rules about product placement in lyrics. I Am the Walrus. Despite Lennon claiming the song was complete nonsense, the BBC still interpreted it to be about sex. While the artist's interpretation of their work is equally as valid as any listener's, including a politician's, the extent of BBC censors appointing themselves as guardians, protecting listeners' ears from the vituperous profanity of the Beatles. God forbid British kids hear a song that mentions Coca-Cola. I'm getting a little off topic here. The point is that mainstream culture and the powers that be are usually quite antagonistic to the counterculture. Here's some, but by no means all, historical countercultures, at least in the US. In the 30s, young people danced to jazz music at dance clubs around the country. The universal appeal of the music across all American races, whose most noted musicians were black, broke the color barrier decades before the so-called civil rights movement. The 50s saw the rise of rock and roll, embodied by Elvis Presley, who was lambasted as a degenerate and a dangerous influence on the youth. Beatlemania in the 60s saw similar criticism as mentioned earlier. The rise of hippie culture from opposition to the Vietnam War reached its zenith in Woodstock in 1969 and continued into the 70s. This decade would see the rise of disco, which was created by black homosexuals, which only added credibility to the allegations of the music being sexualizing and perverted. The 70s also saw the rise of metal as a musical genre, as well as punk music, which would remain popular well into the 90s. The 90s, as well as the late 80s, saw the rise of rap music, which was criticized for, as mentioned before, disrespecting women and legislation enforcement. Hip-hop and grunge would also emerge as underground musical genres. This is by no means a comprehensive list, but it should be illustrative. Most countercultures have a musical genre associated with them, one that eventually becomes mainstream. Fans of certain types of music grow older and gain the levers of power themselves. Record labels realize it's profitable to sign on these musicians and market to young people, making what was once a horrific blight upon taste and moral sensibilities becomes normal. Then, eventually, it becomes an amusing anachronism. If one were to go back even further, I am quite certain you could find other countercultures nobody's heard of that were quite popular in their times. For example, minstrel acts of the early to mid-1800s were very popular. White performers wore blackface and would impersonate blacks, including black slaves, and sing in exaggerated ebonics, much to the great amusement of their audiences. Moral busybodies of the day found it degrading to the performers, and I'm sure someone watching this video right now, hearing about it for the first time, would suspect that these minstrel acts were only popular because these racists found the mockery of blacks to be enjoyable. Spoiler alert, it was never about racism. But look at the timeline again. Notice anything missing? Well, I did. Where is the counterculture of the 2000s and the 2010s? These decades are in the rear view, and despite having lived through it myself, I have no recollection of there ever being a clear or obvious underground culture. I mean, it's not like young people as a group suddenly decided not to rebel against authority figures for 2 decades, so what gives? Where are the new breakout genres of music? Well, what are people's favorite genres of music nowadays? Some people like punk, some people like jazz, some people like symphonic metal, and you, dear viewer, have your own favorite genre. Feel free to fill it in. But then I realized I was thinking about it all wrong. Then it hit me.
Conservatism is the new counterculture.
Conservatism isn't a counterculture whatsoever. The Tea Party movement in the late 00s and early 2010s, after it was subverted by statist activists, as well as the 2016 Trump campaign, although they were treated as underground, they were overtly attempting to enter mainstream society rather than use any isolation from the mainstream as an opportunity to establish themselves as cultural competitors. They were controlled, directed, and centralized around mainstream personalities. I mean, for goodness sake, Donald Trump was extremely mainstream. He used the political system to his advantage and bragged about doing so. The behavioral norms of a true counterculture diverge from mainstream culture, whereas political conservatism reinforces mainstream cultural norms. Their only real disagreement being a set of preferences regarding how much and on what government should be allowed to spend other people's money. Liberalism, socialism, and any other set of political preferences aren't countercultural either for the exact same reason. So, where is the counterculture? I realized I was thinking about it all wrong in regards to what a counterculture would look like today. I assumed any underground movement would consolidate around a new music genre. Not so. The counterculture is the torrenters, the media sharers, the illegal downloaders, and copyright violators. When rebellion against authority means having virtually unlimited and unrestricted access to the songs its individual participants want to listen to, why would they have a single genre? The soundtrack of today's underground is every song ever recorded. Every rebel can now pick and choose the songs they want to listen to, and there is no countercultural esteem associated with a single genre of music. Every individual is able to become their own musical counterculture, requiring only a device to connect to the internet. But it goes one step further, in fact, multiple steps further. TV shows, movies, even video games are all shared and distributed in complete contempt of mainstream culture's pretense of copyright or patent legislation. Cryptocurrency gives this counterculture a medium of exchange that requires zero participation with mainstream white markets, hidden from the prying eyes of moral busybodies. Does the mainstream culture disapprove? You bet it does. Starting in the 2000s, there was a propaganda effort to get young people to stop illegally downloading music, with the media making examples out of college kids who were expelled when they were caught with 500 quadrillion exabytes of music. Finger-wagging moral busybodies claim copying music files constitutes theft. And somehow, kids are stealing from big record corporations for copying files, even though theft implies the original owner is somehow deprived of property, and there is no way to prove theft even occurred because copyright and the principle of intellectual property is absolute nonsense. Big corporations like Nintendo routinely crack down on fan games and emulator sites. Video games ship with such massive anti-piracy DRM measures that they make up 1/3 of a AAA game's entire computer file size and hamper game performance. Cryptocurrency is often evoked as a terrorist currency associated with terrorists, drug dealers, and other groups the state arbitrarily and hypocritically deemed to be criminals. Propaganda about the spooky-sounding dark web pops up every now and again, evoking images of malevolent computer hackers performing dastardly deeds. Suffice to say, it is just propaganda, and it's not working. But what makes this most interesting, at least to me, is the extent to which millions of ordinary people around the world have adopted a fundamentally libertarian praxis without even being ideological libertarians. Ask most kids downloading the new season of Harley Quinn, I guarantee you, they'll say that taxation is the price we pay for a free society, while actively undermining the institutions taxes are paid to support. How can this be? What's really going on here? The internet has enabled new forms of communication and information sharing that fundamentally alters the economics of violence, making it far less profitable than at any point in history, while making the acquisition of media through presently illegal means massively profitable. Before, extracting resources from media thieves was reasonably profitable for states. Now that media can be transferred instantly along encrypted peer-to-peer exchanges, the state needs more resources to track down one pirate, more so than they could ever hope to extract from them in fines. This shift in incentive dynamics incentivizes participation before a coherent ideological framework explaining what the hell is going on can even become mainstream. Nevertheless, at some point, the cognitive dissonance of the Gen Z torrenter needs to be reconciled. What do you think happens when a whole generation of people who grew up on media they acquired illegally come of age? Will they continue to enforce ideas of idea monopolization they helped make unenforceable? Of course not. The industrial model of exchange simply doesn't work anymore. The days of companies like Disney are behind us, and their continued existence is a timescale measured in weeks rather than decades. We're entering a new age, the imagination age. The full implications of this transition are still being realized as we speak, and we can expect it to keep going for a few more years yet, even decades. But I have reasons to be optimistic. The coronavirus madness is accelerating this process, forcing businesses to adopt work-from-home models and shutting down barbaric Prussian model indoctrination centers in favor of asymmetric online learning models. At the time of this recording, I predict the lockdowns will go on for a few more months yet. Plenty of time for this way of doing business to become the new normal. Who's going to want to go back to dressing up in hot, stuffy suits and sit in traffic jams for 2 hours a day just to go to work, when they can just pull up a chair and go to work at home? Especially if it's more profitable for them to do so. They can save money on gas, for goodness sake. And what poor hatchling is excited to go back to government schooling? Sure, effort will be put into returning society to its pre-corona arrangements, but that world is gone and it's not coming back. But maybe that's a good thing. The world before corona was on the brink of World War III, for God's sake. The world is changing in ways never before seen since the Industrial Revolution. And unlike the Industrial Revolution, the full implications will be realized in our lifetimes, instead of being realized over centuries. I salute you, torrenters, pirates, and software crackers. You know not what you do, but you're changing the world. You're changing the economic returns of violence, and because of it, we will be freer than at any point in history. Torrent on, my friends. Questions, comments, critique? What do you think about this? Am I on the mark? Do you totally not download things illegally? Leave a comment below. Support me on Patreon. Like, share, and subscribe to become a heretic today.